the time of initial European contact, 10 million native peoples lived in the modern boundaries of the United States. In the next 400 years, European settlers and the U.S. government killed all but 300,000 native people through disease, starvation, forced resettlement, and outright violence. Today there are more than 5.2 million indigenous peoples in the United States, only half of what the population was before European contact. They still face significant discrimination and marginalization. Native Americans are not a homogeneous group, and the Native American designation includes people from more than 100 nations that have distinct languages, cultures, and religious practices throughout the continental U.S. and Alaska. This fall, Mashpee Wampanoag Native Americans in Massachusetts are fighting to regain control of their lands after the Trump administration revoked the federal protection and trust status the Mashpee had previously relied upon. This Native American tribe is the one that famously helped Mayflower passengers plant food and harvest enough to survive. We celebrate that first Thanksgiving each year on the third Thursday of November, but fail to acknowledge the reality of the Mashpee people today. Despite saving the Pilgrims from starvation and being the original occupants of the land, the Mashpee are still fighting for control of just 321 acres of their original land. All other land was taken away long ago and is privately held today. Wamsuta James, a Wampanoag whose ancestors were involved in this first contact, said, "We the Wampanoag welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end." The United States has a long history of breaking land rights treaties with Native peoples whose land the U.S. government was encroaching upon. Over the past several centuries, Native peoples have been moved off of their ancestral lands and forced to settle elsewhere. Today, about 34% live on reservation trust land designated for their control by the U.S. government. Conflict between Native peoples and the U.S. government still occur in the 21st century. A notable infringement on Native lands is the Dakota Access Pipeline that would move oil from North Dakota to Illinois. The pipeline was a threat to the water supply of the Standing Rock Sioux people, as well as an infringement on Native lands that were sacred cultural places for the tribe and tribal burial grounds. Protests began in August 2016 as the pipeline came closer to the sacred lands and escalated over the course of several months. Police used rubber bullets, tear gas, water hoses in freezing weather, and even tasers to force protesters to leave their protest sites. Native American claims to the land are still being questioned by the Trump administration as President Trump works to continue the pipeline through their sacred lands. The conditions on reservations are comparable to third world living conditions around the world. Households are crowded, with most people relying on money from Social Security due to the scarcity of jobs available around reservations. 4 to 8 out of 10 Native Americans are unemployed, and many of those with employment receive working wages of below minimum wage. American Indian and Alaska Natives have lower levels of health compared to other Americans. There is a lower life expectancy and higher rates of disease due to low education, poverty on reservations, discrimination of health services, and having conflicting cultural beliefs. It is said that Native Americans are expected to live 5.5 years shorter than other Americans due to this discrimination and lack of health care on reservations.
Go.
An issue compounded by land disputes is voter suppression of Native American populations. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 declared all Native Americans born in the U.S. citizens, while the 15th Amendment and Voting Rights Act of 1965 declared that a citizen's right to vote can't be denied by race or color, and banned practices that abridged these rights. However, Native Americans have still been fighting to preserve their voting rights to this day. North Dakota's voter ID laws require every citizen to show identification that includes a physical street address. However, many reservations do not use physical street addresses. Many reservations use P.O. boxes for mailing addresses, but these are not acceptable to qualify for an ID used at polling places. Thus, Native Americans are at least twice as likely to not have a qualifying ID compared to non-Native Americans, and therefore weren't able to vote in the 2018 general election. An October 2018 Supreme Court ruling stated that while the court recognized that Native Americans don't normally have residential addresses, they would do nothing to change the law that requires one. Daniel L. Loveland, a U.S. District Court judge, explained that the state has acknowledged that Native American communities often lack residential street addresses. Nevertheless, under current state law, an individual who does not have a current residential street address will never be qualified to vote. The district court found the law discriminatory but still chooses to leave it standing. Residents that used qualifying voter IDs in the primary elections will not be able to use them in November during the general election. It not only affects the residents' fundamental rights to vote, but changes the outcome of elections. Native American organizations have been working to ensure barriers to voting are reversed, but bills introduced to protect these voting rights have been unsuccessful year after year. In 2015, the Native American Rights Fund created the Native American Voting Rights Coalition to help try and remove barriers to voter registration and voting. Although organizations have worked to provide options for obtaining the qualified ID, the process to try and acquire a legal street address is lengthy and difficult. A serious issue facing Native American women is sexual violence. The percent of Indigenous women living in the United States that have experienced sexual violence is increasing at a rapid rate. More than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence, and more than 1 in 2 have experienced sexual violence. 90% of Native Americans that have experienced violence were assaulted by a non-tribal member. This is one of the first reports to show that the race of perpetrators of violence against Native women were mostly white. Alaska Natives are experiencing the highest rates of sexual assault and domestic violence. Tribal courts do not have the jurisdiction to prosecute non-tribal members for many crimes like sexual assault and rape, even if they occur on tribal land. This is a huge issue because most violence that happens comes from a non-tribal member, so victims have a much more limited pathway to justice than victims of other races. Additionally, laws in these reservations have little law enforcement and hardly any funds given to them by the federal government. In 1999, the release of the initial report given by the Department of Justice stated that Native Americans are 2.5 times more likely to experience sexual assault and rape than any other ethnic group in the United States. Because of these results, the Violence Against Women Act was created to add protection to Native Americans. This act gave tribal nations the power to prosecute non-tribal members that have committed violence against an Indigenous person. This act went into effect in 2015, but many tribes still struggle with gaining the resources necessary to prosecute perpetrators and enforce the law. American Indians and Alaska Native women have gone missing or have been murdered at higher than normal rates. The lack of adequate federal response is surprising and alarming to Indigenous people and should receive national attention. It is also proven that women on some reservations are 10 times more likely to be murdered than the national average. The children that grow up in these reservations that view this violence have been found to have PTSD at a rate 3 times higher than the general population. This disproportionate violence against Native peoples is a significant form of racial discrimination. Indian and Alaska Native students have an open opportunity for education through the public school system in the United States. Even with this opportunity, Native Americans' academic performance scores are lower than their peers. In the last 10 years, Native Americans are the only ones that have not improved in reading or math scores. Throughout the nation, Native Americans face the lowest high school graduation rates, and from those graduates, even fewer go to college. Education is key to success in the 21st century, and the federal government has a responsibility to provide a quality education to Native Americans. Historically, this has been difficult to achieve because the Native Americans and Alaska Natives do not speak English. They sometimes would be punished for speaking their native language at school. In the United Nations Draft Declaration, it states, Indigenous children have the right to all levels and forms of education of the state. All Indigenous peoples also have this right and the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. Indigenous children living outside their communities have the right to be provided access to education in their own culture and language. Native Americans can acquire this education through a Native Class Act, which recognizes and supports roles such as language immersion school programs and increases tribal control over the education of tribal citizens. Despite the efforts being made, significant roadblocks remain because of limited access to funding, language barriers, cultural differences, and racial discrimination. Over the centuries, Native Americans and Alaska Native people have been systematically oppressed, and the discrimination continues today. Federal policies and adequate funding, as well as public attention and self-evaluation, are needed to make lasting change to racial discrimination and systematic oppression.